All right, the man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. Next, we have Peter Jones. Peter Jones? Peter Jones is based on Vancouver Island. That's in Canada. He's been working on Lustre project for 10 years through various companies and roles, and currently runs the Lustre engineering team at Intel. He's the co-lead of the OpenSFS Lustre working group. He's going to speak to us today about the community release. Peter Jones.
Hey. Thanks, everyone. Okay, can you hear me okay? Yeah, sounds like it. Okay, so thanks. So as always, it's someone has to get the short straw to follow Steve, and this year it's me, unfortunately. So I'm going to be talking about the community releases. First of all, I want to give a plug for the Lustre working group. So this has been going on for a while under a couple of incarnations, but basically is the central clearinghouse for anything relating to the Lustre community releases. So at the tail end of last year, myself and Saab, who's sitting over here, for those who don't know him, took over running this group as Chris Marone stepped down. So he'd been doing that for a couple of years, so thanks for all his efforts there. And if you want to know a bit more about what we get up to, you can follow the link here and see. We have meetings every couple of weeks talking about things, and then keep in touch in between on the mailing lists. So one of the things that we've been involved with is the Lustre Community Survey, which we've been doing every year in the early spring, and that's been going on for 5 years now. And I'm pleased to say that this year was actually the highest level of respondents we'd ever had. Almost 100 people took the time to fill out details about their production usage of Lustre. So the full details you can again look on the wiki if you want to poke into that, but I've picked out what I think are the highlights of the results this year to talk about. So first of all, the versions. So this is always interesting to see what people are running in production. And I know that people look to data like this when they're making their own decisions about what to do at a site. So last year, the big, surprising development here was that 1.8 was finally usurped as the most commonly used release. 1.8 had a number of releases over time, many years, and since then we've increased the frequency of the releases we put out. So there was a broader spread. And 1.8, again, had been a very good, stable release. A number of vendors had been behind that for promoting that for years, so there were a lot of deployments out there. However, it's at that time, it's Red Hat 5 servers, and gradually these systems are now coming out of service or being upgraded. And so, last year, 2.5 took over as the most commonly run production release. Most of the vendors I'm aware of, have a release based on 2.5 as what they're using in the field at the moment. So there's no surprise there. But that's commonly used. But what is perhaps more surprising is that there's showing up usage of 2.8 in production. So maybe that doesn't immediately strike you as odd, but at the time that this survey was taken, it was actually before the 2.8 release happened. So this is actually people who are entrusting their production, clusters to, pre-release software. So I think that's really testimony to the strides we've made in terms of quality with the Lustre releases in recent years. And even, with the Lustre 2.7, it's the second most commonly used release out there. Is again a relatively current release. So, I'm really happy to see that. Looking at Linux distributions, these, fairly consistent with what we've seen in previous years. It's a Red Hat 6 and Red Hat derivatives like CentOS and Scientific Linux, the most commonly used Linux distributions among the respondents. This year we did see Red Hat 5 tail off, in line again with the 1.8 reduction. And we're starting to see inroads in Red Hat 7. And so I would expect, probably we'll see next year that, again, Red Hat 7 will be even stronger, but still, strong presence from Red Hat 6. Looking at networks, again, we have quite a lot of variety in this area of what people are running, and this is fairly consistent with what we've seen previous years. New features. So, this is something that, because sometimes, you put a lot of effort into these releases, you put software out there, you don't really have much feedback, and it's unclear, did we do a really good job? Is there just no problems with this software, or is no one actually using it? It's really hard to kind of know what's going on. So this does, provide some data to give us some background about what people are doing. And one of the things I like to look at with this data is to do the comparison of what people's stated intents are versus, the next year to see what, the actual data is. So the lower line of these two for each feature, the blue line is what people are actually using in production, the features, what they're using today. And then the upper line, the red line, is what their intent is to use in the coming year, what they expect to do. And so, sometimes, people may, intend to be using something, and then perhaps when they evaluate it more closely and test it, they think, well, this isn't ready, or, this feature isn't what I thought it was. So they may not actually, it might not actually come to fruition. But what we've seen this year with ZFS, Lustron ZFS, that came in several years ago with the big deployment Livermore, the Sequoia deployment with Lustre 2.4 community release. So it's been around for a few years, but last year, we saw people signaling a strong intention to move to Lustron ZFS, and this year we've indeed seen that come through. And it still looks like more, majority of sites are using LDiskFS as a back end, but still it's now a significant, population of people using Lustron ZFS, and I think we will see a lot more, excuse me, in that area, and there will be some talks later on today which perhaps will give you some insight to why I think that. And then the other thing I think that's interesting on this here is, there's strong signals to adopt LFSCK and D&E, and so the way I interpret this data is that this is people who are basically running perhaps an older release where these features aren't fully implemented, and they're planning to move to a more current release where they can take advantage of these in the coming year. So I think that this is an indicator that next year, on this survey, we'll see strong adoption of the 2.8 release as people are moving to try and take advantage of these desirable features. So finally, this is another thing is looking at the support situation. Lustre, as Steve said, is open source, free to use software. People do, many people will choose to work with a vendor just in case they have some, so they have someone to turn to as part of the overall solution if they do run into issues. But it is free open source, free to use software, and this is pretty consistent data. We've seen that there's still a healthy population of people out there who are just relying on their in-house expertise and perhaps the mailing list to get some assistance. So quality is an area that perhaps gets overlooked a little bit. So I wanted to just talk a bit about this. We have well-established release validation practices that we've developed over the years, and those have really served us well. But this is an area we continually need to evolve what we're doing to meet new demands, and nothing stands still in HPC, right? So one area we've had is we had some of our most senior engineers who are working on exascale developments. We're really giving some thought about how they could possibly test the work they're doing with the sort of scale that ultimately will be running, and perhaps even this kind of systems, I mean, it's pretty hard to get the hardware budget to have a comparable system to some of these, huge future deployments, but maybe some of the technology is not even fully ready yet. It's still, in production. But so the way they approach this is to look at ways to simulate the kind of pathological conditions that you do experience in production environments. So things like packet drop on the network or low memory conditions, simulating load conditions for those kind of scenarios. And that's proven very useful for us to find things that are very, races or, just weaknesses in the code that, maybe just would come up very occasionally. The logic would break down under some very rare circumstances. And those kind of bugs are really hard. You get a report from the field. Maybe people don't even bother to report it because it was just a one-off, never happened again. But we've found, using this, we've actually found things that have been there since, almost since Luster's inception, that we've been able to actually address. And so that's been very useful. And then another thing is static code analysis tools. So using algorithms to look at coding patterns that have been proven to often result in bugs and can often find actual real bugs. And so Bull have presented at past conferences about work they were doing using Coverity. But it's interesting that there's all these, that these different tools obviously have different algorithms, and they often can find different issues. And so we've also had OpenSFS for funding some work using Clang. And I know more recently, due to the working with the upstream Linux community, Oleg Droykin, the gatekeeper, has been experimenting with SMatch and found a number of again very long-standing flaws in the Lustre code that this threw up fairly quickly that other we hadn't found in our own testing, we hadn't had reported from the field, we hadn't other static code analysis tools hadn't found, but yet legitimate bugs that can be matched to some reports that maybe we've had anecdotally over the years. So and that's segueing on slight there with the working with the upstream Linux community. It has been, I think, a really beneficial exercise. I mean, James Simmons is going to talk a bit more about that effort. But just from my perspective, seeing that we're interacting with people who are very knowledgeable about developing the Linux kernel, but are less experienced with Lustre, and having to explain to them, why do you do this way? And sometimes, the rationale behind something that's 10 years ago maybe it was true, but it no longer is. And revisiting that, and maybe there've been a few things that we've changed from that, and just. So that's been useful, and it's coming up to 4 years now since the WAM Cloud team joined Intel, and I hadn't realized before joining Intel quite how much software development happened at Intel. So we are able to, within Intel, sort of leverage some of the experience there in different areas. For example, with the security work that Indiana University are doing, funded by OpenSFS, that is targeted for the 2.9 release. We're able to get, we've been able to get access to security experts to be able to review that design. And so, the end result will be hopefully a more robust, design to that work that we can then, have more confidence about. And, a bit of an omission on this slide, I realize, so sorry for that, but, not to underestimate as well the influence of people within, the expertise of people within the Lustre community. And so having our releases be, available, as we're developing the releases, all the interim builds are available for testing, and that allows people to give them a try ahead of time. And that does mean we're able to get really good feedback and fix things that would otherwise have been issues, in the final release, and so it makes for a better quality release. And, as we saw earlier on, some people like that so much they decide to run with that in production. So the latest community release has been the 2.8 release. Just went GA a few weeks ago. So obviously, kind of the glaring thing here is that this release was really much later than originally scheduled. It was, intended, to come out September of last year, and there's been a few factors behind it, but the overriding factor behind this delay was the basically the increased quality practice we have now. So I have no doubt, I've been involved in Lustre releases for a long time now, and if this, a couple of years ago, if we'd been doing the same release, there's no doubt this release would have come out on time, but I think people would have been less happy with it. So, we had at the time, as I said, Oak Ridge were very helpful with this, testing the D&E feature, and were giving us favorable reports from the work. It was all holding up with the normal kind of testing they were doing. But we were finding with our soak test harness, which was a new variable we introduced during this cycle, that we could break D&E recovery within a few minutes of running. So it's taken a while to step through and work through. DNA is a very complex feature with multiple metadata servers, very complex, recovery scenarios to work through, all different edge cases. And so it's taken a while to sort of chip away at those and then find the next one and the next one as we develop those. But I think as a result, we've now got to a state where we have a really robust release, and I do expect this to be a well-used release. And so I'm sure there'll still be some other things we need to fix as people start using this in production. I mean, this is complex software, but I do think we're coming from a much stronger starting point. And and I think going forward as well, we now have established a stronger baseline, and we've altered our development practices so that when we have gargantuan major shift changes to the Lustre code base, that we actually have those segregated now. So for example, I know tomorrow there's a presentation about the multi-rail development, and that's being done in a separate sandbox essentially, so it can be completely qualified and tested separately before it's folded in, and we don't end up with a state where maybe you've got this partial feature that maybe is you're unsure whether you should actually release with that state. And so I think we'll see a more predictable cadence going forward with the community releases, or certainly not the delays we've seen to this extent. So thanks to Chris Morone of Livermore he had developed some quite sophisticated scripts to generate this data very quickly, the contributions on the release, so thanks for that, Chris. And so you can see this is basically code that's been written, or everything within the almost a year actually release cycle for 2.8. Probably the thing that jumps out, the data on the left is the number of commits, and then on the right is the lines of code changed. There's normally fairly close match between the two. The one thing that jumps out as being a bit larger is the Oak Ridge contribution on the right for the lines of code changed is more, a larger proportion, and this is because of James Simmons, the work he's been doing on the upstream client. It's a lot of reformatting work there that's touching huge amounts of lines of code and doing those updates. So that's where the discrepancy is there, or apparent discrepancy. And then, of course, actually writing the code is only part of the work that goes into the releases, and so it's a significant amount of effort goes into the reviewing of the code. So this is an important part of our quality practice, is to have peer review of any proposed change before it's allowed to actually land in the canonical tree. So basically, Lustre is very complex software, and sometimes changing an area of code can have some unintended effects elsewhere. So having at least 2 engineers who are experienced in that area of code to sort of look it over carefully and make sure that they've thought through those scenarios and that the change should be, they believe the change should be okay is an important step. Looking at Lustre 2.8 compared to releases in recent releases over the years, fairly comparable in terms of the amount of change and lines of number of commits and lines of code changed. And the one thing that really maybe is different is we're seeing there's a significantly higher number of developers for this release. And so I will say Chris does in his script he does sort of differentiate between people who've maybe made contributions indirectly through working on the Linux kernel, and then that's come in. Those are not included in these numbers. These are people who've actually pushed, consciously made a choice to submit a change to Lustre and have pushed change into Gerrit, and those have worked their way through the system and included in the release. So it would be a higher number if you included those others, but this is a more comparable, because obviously the upstream client has only been a factor in the last few years. But so these are comparable data. So I'm not only going to touch briefly on the 2.9 release because Andreas is up next and he's going to be talking in more detail about the features here, but I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that this is the release we're working on right now, and so you can see more detail on the wiki, on Lustre.org wiki if you like, and But this is a release, we'll know what the feature set is at the end of next month when the feature freeze happens, and then the release is due out later in the summer. And then longer term, we do have some really interesting developments that I know that people have been at. You can see the full details of development going on the projects page on luster.org, and that we encourage everyone who's working on development to record what they're up to there, so that people who have a shared interest can provide the potential for collaboration, or at least to not to avoid duplication of effort, and flag early if there's possible conflicts of people doing development in the same area, so they can make sure that they integrate those their work and the future work in, so that they don't turn up and find that their work is already obsolete when they've just believed they finished it. Yes, there's 3 very interesting features here, which are all going to be talked about later on in the conference. So one thing I felt we've been missing over recent years, we had stepped away with a roadmap from having a graphical roadmap. And the reasoning behind this was that perhaps this created unreasonable expectations about the timing, and there was a commitment to having features in a certain time. But we revisited that thinking recently in the Lustre Working Group, and decided that overall people understand what a roadmap is and that things are subject to change. And there was actually some real benefit to having having a graphical roadmap for people to point to, and that just gave people confidence in who are coming up new, that there was ongoing development, and this was an active project. So here's what you'll see now if you go to the link, the roadmap link on lustre.org. So I don't know if you can see that. I see people squinting at the back, but don't worry, if you go and look at it on lustre.org, it's there and you can see it more easily. But just to give a sense of the kind of features that are coming and roughly where we expect them to fall. And obviously we'll update this over time as we know more about how the development's unfolding and tracking to plan. And going on to documentation, so I like to give a plug always for documentation. This is an area where really anyone who's able to use Lustre is able to help on the documentation. At the very least, if you find something in the instructions which is inaccurate or incomplete, you can just flag that. I mean, ideally you could fix it, but if that's you don't have time or you're not sure what the real answer should be, just flagging it means that people are aware that this is an area that needs revisiting. I mean, that can be the problem as well, as often people who are the most expert in a certain area, they're not the ones who are looking at the manual. It's the people who are doing it for the first time who are looking and noticing when what's written down doesn't match reality. So, and in particularly in this area, Ken Rawlings from Indiana is going to be talking a bit later on about the efforts to really boost the quality and the accuracy of the content on lustre.org, and this is really something that a lot of people could get involved in. So if you've got any time to do that, I would really encourage you to do so. That really is beneficial for anyone who's coming up to Lustre for the first time. Lustre.org is the first thing they're going to hit when they Google Lustre, and it would be really good for people to come away from that with a good impression. So just to recap, I think there's strong community adoption of recent releases, and that's a really positive thing, and what it says about our increasing quality over the years. And obviously we've still got scope for more improvement there, but I see that as a positive sign that we're making some headway. Lustre 2.8 is GA, and I'm expecting strong adoption of that release. There's some interesting developments in progress, and you'll obviously hear a bit more about those over the next few days. And there's no shortage of work to do on the community releases or the wiki pages, etc., for anyone who's interested in participating. So that's my presentation. Is any questions from anyone?